Netflix releases the Monster movie, which tells the story of Ed Gein, one of the most disturbing criminals in American history. A man whose crimes were so bizarre, so macabre, that inspired iconic horror characters like Norman Bates of Psychosis, Leatherface of the Electric Saw Massacre, and Buffalo Bill of The Silence of the Innocent. But the reality behind these films is much worse than any fiction could create. The case of Ed Gein shocked the world in 1957 and is still one of the most studied by forensic psychology. I'm the presenter of Night-Born Fear, and today we are going to dive into the mind of the man that the press called the Plainfield Butcher. A story so disturbing that you will question the limits of human insanity. If you are curious about the Netflix Monster movie, subscribe now to Night-Born Fear and activate the bell, because we are going to reveal the real facts behind the fiction. And I assure you that the truth is much more terrifying than any Hollywood script. Edward Theodore Gein was born on August 27, 1906, in La Crosse, Wisconsin. He was the second son of George Philip Gein and Augusta Wilhelmine Gein. His older brother Henry was born in 1901. The Gein family lived on an isolated farm in the outskirts of Plainfield, Wisconsin, a remote place that would become a stage for unimaginable horrors decades later. George Gein was a failed alcoholic who rarely managed to keep a job. Violent when drunk, he was despised by his own wife. Augusta Gein was an extremely religious, fanatical, and domineering woman. She saw the outside world as a place of sin and corruption, especially women, whom she considered instruments of the devil. Augusta believed that all women except herself were prostitutes and immoral creatures that would lead men to perdition. Prompt 1906, rural Wisconsin, isolated farmhouse exterior, desolate countryside landscape. Victorian era, poor family homestead, alcoholic father George Gein and domineering religious mother Augusta Gein with two young boys, Henry and Edward. Oppressive family atmosphere, photorealistic historical period accuracy, somber sepia-toned documentary style. Augusta raised her two children in complete social isolation. She forbade them to make friends, to interact with other children, to have any normal social life. Every night Augusta read excerpts from the Old Testament for Ed and Henry, obsessively focusing on passages about death, murder, and divine punishment. She emphasized especially the verses about sinful women and God's wrath against immorality. Ed grew up believing that his mother was the only pure and holy woman in the world, and that all the others were repugnant and sinful creatures. The family farm was so isolated that Ed rarely saw other people. When he needed to go to town to buy supplements, the children mocked him for his strange appearance and inappropriate behavior. Ed had protruding eyes, an empty expression on his face, and frequently smiled inappropriately at inappropriate moments. He was seen as strange, weird, different. At school, Ed had average academic performance, but was considered a problematic student due to his bizarre behavior. He laughed alone for no apparent reason, made strange comments out of context, and had extreme difficulty interacting socially with colleagues and teachers. The teachers noticed that Ed seemed to always be in his own world, disconnected from reality around him. But Ed was obedient at home, dedicated to his mother in an obsessive way. He did everything Augusta told him to do, without questioning, without hesitating. For Ed, his mother was a divine, infallible figure, the only person in the world who really mattered. This sick devotion to his mother would become the root of all the madness that was to come. In 1940, when Ed was 34 years old, his father, George Gein, died of natural causes related to chronic alcoholism. His death was practically unnoticed by Ed and Augusta, who saw him as an insignificant and despicable figure. With George out of the way, Augusta intensified his control over the children even more. Ed and his brother Henry worked like crazy in the Plainfield region, doing manual work and helping local farmers. The money they earned went straight to Augusta, who controlled all the family finances. Henry began to question Augusta's suffocating influence on Ed. He expressed concern that the sick devotion of his brother to his mother was not healthy, that they needed to have their own lives. Ed did not like these conversations and was visibly irritated when Henry criticized Augusta. On May 16, 1944, Ed and Henry were burning vegetation on their property when the fire broke out. Ed ran to the city for help, saying he had lost Henry in the smoke. When the firemen arrived, Ed took them directly to Henry's body, something strange for someone who had supposedly lost his brother in the midst of the confusion. Henry's body was found in an area not hit by the fire, lying on the ground. There were wounds on the head that were not consistent with death from inhalation of smoke or burns. Despite the extremely suspicious circumstances, the city's legislator, who knew the Gein family, declared death as suffocation caused by the smoke. No additional investigation was conducted. Ed Gein had just come out unpunished from his likely first murder. Now he and Augusta were alone on the isolated farm. Ed was now 38 years old and lived only to serve his mother. He had no friends, no social life, no relationships of any kind. Augusta was his whole world. But in December 1945, Augusta suffered her first outburst, which left her partially paralyzed. Ed became his caretaker in full time, dedicating every moment of his existence to taking care of her. Augusta suffered a second fatal outburst on December 29, 1945, at the age of 67. For Ed Gein, Augusta's death was the end of the world. The only person he loved, the only person who gave meaning to his existence, had disappeared. Ed was completely devastated. He kept Augusta's room exactly as she had left it, untouched, preserved as a sanctuary. He locked several parts of the house, keeping them exactly as they were when Augusta was alive. Ed lived only in small sections of the farm, leaving the rest of the house as a museum dedicated to his mother's memory. Ed continued to do manual work in the region, but his behavior became even stranger after Augusta's death. He used to go to the local hardware store, where he spent hours reading magazines about human anatomy and violent crimes. Plainfield residents found Ed strange but harmless. He was seen as a lonely and strange man, but no one considered him dangerous, as they were mistaken. Between 1947 and 1952, Ed Gein began visiting local cemeteries at night. He read the newspapers, looking for newly buried women who looked like his mother. Then, under the cover of darkness, Ed buried the bodies. He took the corpses home, or parts of them, to his isolated farm. Ed never admitted how many graves he had buried exactly, but investigators estimate that there were at least 9, possibly more. What Ed did with these bodies was even more disturbing. He dismembered them on his farm, keeping specific parts. Ed developed an obsession with human skin, especially the skin of women who resembled Augusta. He literally liked and treated human skin like leather, creating macabre objects. Ed made masks with the skin of the faces he removed from the corpses. He wore these masks and clothes made of human skin, walking around the farm at night, pretending to be his mother. He created a complete vest made of female torso, which he wore under his clothes. Ed made bandages with human skin, chairs covers, even a box to store personal objects. Human skulls were used as bowls. Bones were transformed into domestic utensils. But the desecration of tombs was not enough to satisfy Ed Gein's sick mind. The bodies buried days or weeks ago were in decomposition. They were not fresh enough for their macabre purposes. Ed needed more recent, more preserved bodies. On December 8, 1954, Mary Hogan, 51, owner of a bar in Pine Grove, Wisconsin, mysteriously disappeared. When customers arrived at the bar that night, they found the door open, the lights on, but no sign of Mary. There was a large pool of blood on the floor and a trail of blood leading to the back door. A .32 caliber bullet cartridge was found on the floor. The police investigated, but found no concrete clues about Mary Hogan's whereabouts. The case was left unsolved, filed as a missing person. What no one knew was that Ed Gein had shot Mary Hogan in the head, carried her body into his truck and taken to his farm. There, he hung Mary's body in his workshop, beheaded and viscerated it, and began to dismember it methodically. Ed kept Mary's skull, her face skin turned into a mask, and several other parts of her body for his macabre projects. Ed Gein had crossed the line of tomb raider to murder. Mary Hogan would not be his last victim. During the next 3 years, from 1954 to 1957, Ed continued to live his double life for the residents of Plainfield. He was just the strange Ed Gein, the lonely man who did manual work and was a little weird. But at night, on his isolated farm, Ed lived in a world of madness, surrounded by corpses and parts of human bodies. On November 16, 1957, Bernice Worden, 58 years old, owner of the Plainfield hardware store, disappeared. Bernice was a well-known presence in the community, and her disappearance caused immediate alarm. Her son, Frank Worden, who was a joint sheriff, arrived at the store that afternoon to find it closed, which was unusual. The door was unlocked. The register box was open, and there was blood on the floor. Frank immediately learned that something terrible had happened to his mother. He checked the last receipt of the register box and saw that the last item sold was half a gallon of antifreeze. Frank checked the sales book and saw that Ed Gein had been in the store the night before, asking about antifreeze and saying he would come back the next day to buy it. Frank Worden immediately suspected Ed Gein. He knew Ed as a frequent customer who always acted strangely. Frank contacted Sheriff Art Schley and other officers, and they decided to go to Ed Gein's farm to question him. When the officers arrived at Gein's farm that Saturday afternoon, Ed was not home. He had gone to dinner at a neighbor's house in West Plainfield. The farm was dark, abandoned, with a decadent and sinister appearance. The officers decided to enter the property to look for Bernice Worden. They started at the office, a block away from the main house. Sheriff Art Schley opened the office door and lit his flashlight. What he saw at that moment would haunt him for the rest of his life. Hanging upside down on meat hooks, completely decapitated and eviscerated like a hunting animal, was the body of Bernice Worden. The body was dressed like a downed deer, with legs tied and hanging. She had been killed with a .22 caliber rifle shot to the head. Her body had been decapitated, and Ed had made an incision from the anus to the neck, removing all internal organs. The officers were horrified. They immediately isolated the scene and called for reinforcements. When more officers arrived and began to investigate the main house, they discovered that the office was just the beginning. Ed Gein's house was literally a museum of human horrors. In each room, investigators found more and more disturbing evidence. The living room had sofas lined with human skin. There were slats made of human skin stretched over armor, garbage baskets made of human skin. There were bowls made of upper halves of human skulls. Like this video now if you are in shock, because what the police found inside that house would change forever the history of American crime. Be sure to comment now. Can you imagine the level of insanity necessary to regularly desecrate tombs? Keep watching because this is just the beginning of Ed Gein's madness. A shoebox contained 9 preserved vulvas. Ed had kept the female genital organs as trophies. There were masks made of real human faces hanging on the walls as decoration. A vest made of a woman's full torso, including breasts, which Ed wore to become a woman. Bags full of preserved human organs. There were beheaded human heads used as bedposts, human lips on a rope like a bizarre necklace. Mary Hogan's skull was found in a bag. Her face had been transformed into a mask. In total, investigators found remains of at least 15 different bodies in Ed Gein's property. Most came from tombs he had desecrated. But at least 2, Mary Hogan and Bernice Worden, were victims of murder. While investigators catalogued the horrible discoveries on the Gein farm, other officers went to pick up Ed at the house where he was having dinner. When the officers arrived and arrested Ed Gein, he did not resist. He was taken into custody and taken back to Plainfield. When questioned about Bernice Worden, Ed initially denied any involvement, but when confronted with the evidence found on his property, Ed eventually confessed. He admitted having shot Bernice Worden at the hardware store, put his body in his truck and taken to his farm. Ed described the process casually, as if he were talking about killing a hunting animal. He did not show remorse or emotion when describing his crimes. When questioned about the other bodies and parts of bodies found in his house, Ed admitted having regularly desecrated tombs between 1947 and 1952. Ed explained that he visited cemeteries at night, read obituaries looking for women who resembled his mother, and then he buried the bodies. He said he was in a state of confusion during these night expeditions and frequently did not remember the details. Ed denied having sexual relations with the bodies. He insisted that the corpses smelled very bad for that. Instead, he said he was fascinated by female anatomy and wanted to understand what it would be like to be a woman. He wanted to become his mother, literally dress her. During the interrogations, psychologists observed that Ed Gein showed clear signs of severe psychosis. He had delusions about his mother, believing that she was still alive in some way. He did not fully understand that he had done something wrong. For Ed, he was simply preserving his mother's memory in the only way that made sense to his sick mind. The news of Ed Gein's crimes spread quickly and shocked not only Plainfield, but the whole country. The press described Gein's farm as the House of Horrors, and Ed as Plainfield's butcher and Wisconsin's maniac. Plainfield's residents were shocked. They knew Ed as a strange man, but never imagined that he was capable of such atrocities. Many felt deceived by having trusted him to do work in their homes and properties. Bernice Worden's hardware store became a place of morbid pilgrimage, with people from all over the country to see where the last crime took place. Gein's farm also attracted curious people, until it was finally burned down by a fire in March 1958. Many in Plainfield approved the burn, wanting to erase the physical memory of the horror that had happened there. Ed Gein was charged with first-degree murder for the death of Bernice Worden. In January 1958, it was determined that Ed was mentally incompetent to be tried. He was sent to the Central State Hospital for the criminally insane in Walpole, Wisconsin. There, he underwent extensive psychiatric evaluations. Psychiatrists diagnosed Ed with schizophrenia and stated that he suffered from serious delusions related to his mother. In 1968, 10 years after his initial hospitalization, doctors determined that Ed was mentally competent enough to be tried. The trial began in November 1968. Ed's defense argued insanity and presented extensive psychiatric evidence of his mental condition. The jury took only a week to reach a verdict. Ed Gein was considered guilty of first-degree murder, but legally insane at the time of the crime. As a result, Ed was sentenced to spend the rest of his life in a psychiatric institution instead of prison. He was sent back to the Central State Hospital, where he remained until 1978, when he was transferred to the Mendota Mental Health Institute in Madison, Wisconsin. During his years at the institution, Ed was described by officials as a model patient. He was polite, cooperative, and liked to read. He spent a lot of time reading magazines and newspapers, particularly interested in stories about his own crimes and how they had influenced popular culture. Ed lived peacefully in the psychiatric institution for decades. He never expressed genuine remorse for his victims, but he was also not violent or problematic. On July 26, 1984, Ed Gein died of respiratory failure caused by cancer at the Mendota Mental Health Institute. He was 77 years old. Ed Gein was buried in the Plainfield Cemetery, near the grave of his mother, Augusta, ironically, the same cemetery where he had desecrated so many graves decades before. His tombstone became a target of vandalism and souvenir hunters. People stole pieces of it as macabre souvenirs. In 2000, the tombstone was completely stolen. It was recovered in 2001. But now it is in undisclosed location. The impact of Ed Gein on popular culture cannot be underestimated. Robert Bloch wrote the psycho romance in 1959, directly inspired by the crimes of Ed Gein. Alfred Hitchcock transformed the book into the iconic 1960 movie, creating the character of Norman Bates. In 1974, the Electric Saw Massacre featured Leatherface, a killer who wore human skin masks, directly based on Ed Gein. In 1991, The Silence of the Innocents featured Buffalo Bill, a murderer who made skin clothes for his victims, again inspired directly by Ed Gein. Countless other films, books, TV shows, and documentaries were based on the crimes of Ed Gein. He became the archetype of the American serial killer, the model for countless fictitious characters. Heavy metal bands wrote songs about him. Horror writers created stories based on his crimes. Ed Gein transcended his real existence and became a legendary figure in American horror. And now, in 2024, Netflix dedicates a whole season of its series Monsters to Ed Gein, introducing his crimes to a new generation. The fascination with Ed Gein persists because his crimes were so bizarre, so beyond normal understanding, that continue to shock people decades later. Psychologists and criminologists studied Ed Gein extensively, trying to understand what created this monster. The answer is in the toxic combination of factors: extreme social isolation since childhood, psychological abuse by a religiously fanatic and dominating mother, the traumatic death of the only person he loved, and a predisposition to serious mental illness. Ed developed a psychosis in which he could not separate his identity from his mother's identity. He literally wanted to make her, dress her, be her. Necrophilia and murders were extreme manifestations of this psychosis. Ed Gein represents an extreme case of maternal pathological attachment combined with serious schizophrenia. He did not kill for sexual pleasure or anger. He killed because in his sick mind, he was preserving and merging with the only person he considered pure, his mother. It is important to remember the real victims of Ed Gein, who are often forgotten in the middle of the fascination with the criminal. Bernice Worden was a respected businesswoman, mother, pillar of her community. She was brutally murdered while working in her own store. Mary Hogan was a hard-working woman who ran a local bar. She was also coldly murdered by Ed Gein. And although Ed has desecrated graves instead of killing these people, the women whose bodies he buried and mutilated also deserve to be remembered. They could not rest in peace because they were raped after death by a maniac. Their families had to deal with the horror of knowing that the bodies of their loved ones were defiled and turned into macabre objects. The real horror of the Ed Gein case is not just what he did, but the suffering he caused so many people, alive and dead. The Ed Gein case fundamentally changed how American society saw violent crimes. Before Ed Gein, the public could not imagine the level of deprivation that a human being was able to achieve. He showed that monsters do not exist only in horror movies. They live among us, disguised as ordinary and harmless people. Ed Gein seemed to be just a lonely and strange farmer. No one suspected that he was living in a house made of human corpses. The case also revealed the flaws in the mental health system of the time. Ed Gein should have received psychiatric treatment long before committing the murder. The signs of serious mental illness were there since childhood, but were ignored. If Ed had received adequate help, perhaps Bernice Worden and Mary Hogan were still alive. Ed Gein's legacy is a dark reminder of the importance of taking mental health seriously and not ignoring signs of abnormal behavior. Today, more than 65 years after Ed Gein's crimes were discovered, Plainfield, Wisconsin, still bears the mark of that horror. The city has a population of about 900 people and is known mainly for being Ed Gein's city. Bernice Worden's hardware store no longer exists, but the place where it was is known to everyone in the city. Morbid tourists still visit Plainfield, looking for traces of the city's dark past. The older residents who lived during the events still remember the shock and horror of that time. Many refuse to talk about Ed Gein, wanting to forget and move on. But for such a small city, It is impossible to completely escape the shadow of Ed Gein. His name is permanently associated with Plainfield, for better or worse. The city represents a reminder that evil can happen anywhere, even in the most unlikely and peaceful place. Ed Gein, the farmer who transformed human bodies into furniture and inspired the greatest villains of horror. Now Netflix debuts The Flyme Monster, the story of Ed Gein, telling this real story that is more terrifying than any fiction. Sign up for Nightborn Fear and activate the bell for more disturbing cases. Leave a like if you're going to watch Monster on Netflix. Comment which detail shocked you the most, and share with true crime fans. They need to know the truth behind the horror. The real monsters don't live in movies. They live in isolated farms. They hide horrors behind closed doors, and nobody suspects until it's too late. This was Nightborn Fear. Stay tuned, stay safe, and until the next investigation.